All right, we'll get going again. My name is Jerry Traphagen. As you can see, I'm a 1985 graduate with my ATBS degree, currently an Alaska Airlines 737 captain. My background is 100% civilian, and as far as union work, which is what I'm talking about today, I am currently on our retirement and insurance committee at work. And trust me, these positions and these committees and everything what he talked about with unions is very necessary. So that's what I started out flying. Do you remember that?
I do.
Yes. Cherokee A275 Victor was one of the planes that LeTourneau had. This is post-LeTourneau picture. But at LeTourneau, after I graduated, I did actually similar to him. I went out to West Texas. You ever heard of Brownfield, Texas?
Yeah.
So I worked at Harris Flying Service for just a couple of months, and then Brian Benson called and asked me to come teach at LeTourneau. So I flight instructed here for 2.5 years. Ended up as an assistant chief flight instructor. And while I was on the internet looking for pictures of one of the airplanes, this one happened to have a interesting end.
Was that you?
No, it was not me. So back when I was instructing, Fred Ritchie, I think, plus Lauren Bittercoffer sometimes did overhauls on our Lycoming engines. So
that's when I flew in '88, I had different paint.
Yes, it did. While I was instructing at LeTourneau, both Steve and I had the opportunity to fly as a part-time co-pilot on a DC-3, operated here at the Gregg County Airport. And then I also had the opportunity to fly pilot service and single pilot charter in a Blanca Super Viking, which actually was for a guy named Jerry Krause. Some of you have heard that he's still missing, but he went to do some summer training with MAF, and I filled in for him that summer. That job actually allowed me to meet my next employer. And that airplane actually helped prepare me for the next job where I flew air ambulance in the Cheyenne 3. And we had a 2XL. I did that for 2 years out of Billings, Montana. When I realized I could live without sweating pretty much year round, I decided I would not be moving back to the South. So after 2 years in Billings, Montana, I went to work for Horizon Air out of Portland, Oregon, where I flew the Metroliner. Yes, the San Antonio Sewer Pipe, also known as the Large Lawn Dart. From there, at that time, upgrades were slow, at least at Horizon, and so after 3.5 years in the right seat of the Metro, I said I want to do something different, so I flew in the right seat of the F-28, which we called the Smurf Jet, one of the nicest hand-flying airplanes you'll ever fly, but they are noisy. After that, I was able to upgrade, not into the big dash in the background, but into the baby dash. From the Dash 8400 was still green in the hangar in Toronto when I left Horizon Air. I was able to be flight instructor, salmon aircraft instructor, check airman, and had the pleasure of doing some certification for the heads-up display in the dash. Horizon was a little bit ahead of its time, and Alaska has in certain respects with technology. We were doing Cat 3 approaches and Dash 8s back in the 90s with the heads-up display, it's a great tool, love flying with it. And in January of 98, I was hired as the first officer with Alaska Airlines, based out of Seattle. And just a question, I saw that fish earlier. Who here really likes to fish? How about for salmon? I want to find out what's the biggest salmon anybody's landed. Come on.
100 pounds.
10 pounds? 21. You want a hat? All right. But I think I got you beat because my next aircraft is about 150,000 pound salmon. So the 737 800. And I've been actually, I trained on the 400, which was what they now call the Classic Series. And then they had a kind of transition training on the 7, and we had 7 and 900s back then. Now we have 7, 8, 9, 900 ER, and we operate all of them. So I'll tell one story of flying before I get into my spiel on unions. But one December morning, departing Fairbanks at dark 30, first flight of the day to Seattle, and trust me, it's cold in Fairbanks in December. We depart, get about halfway to Seattle, and get the little master caution, look up, cargo door, forward cargo door light, and you kind of your eyes leak over to the pressurization panel, and you go, I think we're okay. We pull the checklist out, tells you to look at the pressurization panel, make sure you're pressurized, continue. I fully expected the light to go out on the descent because sometimes you get a little frost or maybe just something with those PSU switches, and it didn't go out because I've seen that before. And so we land, I go get paperwork, we're changing airplanes, and my first officer catches me as I'm walking to the next gate. He said, "Did you walk around the airplane?" I said, "No, I didn't." He said, "You might want to do that." So I walked around, I went down the jetway, walked down, and this is what I saw. It was a kennel with a hole chewed in it by a dog that had chewed the back of the cargo door compartment, had chewed a hole in the ceiling of the cargo compartment with insulation hanging down, had then gone to the back of the cargo compartment and chewed panels in the back of the compartment. So when they went looking for the dog, you see there's a little red in there. They thought maybe he had bled out because there was no noise, but that wasn't the issue. They found him in the very back of the cargo compartment, fast asleep. It was a little husky puppy. But the interesting thing was the mechanic goes, "Did you see what's on top? What's written on top of the kennel?" I said, "No, I can't reach that high. I'm not that tall." And he says, "Well, it says on there, it says, 'Hey, this is my first flight. I might be a little nervous.'" So, ALPA is a large union, and we'll get to that. That's just one of the airlines that we serve, or is part of our group. Let's talk generally about unions. Actually, I'm going to ask you a question. What do you know of that is common now in the American workplace that wasn't before unions had an effect on our? Go for it.
Safety regulations.
Safety regulations, okay. I'll get up. Huh?
I don't have room in my
Dry bag?
No, I flew down here from
Okay.
Charlotte. I don't have room in my
All right. Anybody have any other guesses?
Overtime?
That might be. Yeah, sure.
Paid holidays.
Say again?
Paid holidays.
Paid holidays. That's a good one.
Regulated hours.
Say again?
Regulated hours, like can't work so many hours in a day.
All right. Who all answered? Anybody want it?
Very glass.
How about a 40-hour work week, guys? Yeah. And military leave. Let me just get it up there. You want to pass that back?
I'd like to keep it.
Yeah, very good. I don't even have one of those. So you get 40-hour work week, weekends off, paid vacations, paid holidays, paid sick leave, FMLA, breaks at work, and of course military leave. A lot of things unions have done to affect really almost every American worker, regardless of whether they've been part of the union or not. So why do we have unions in the airline industry? So read that first paragraph with me. In the early days of commercial aviation, mortality rates were quite staggering. An airmail pilot working for the post office in 1918 stood only a 1 chance in 4 of surviving until 1926. That's when private contractors took over, and the situation improved only slightly thereafter. In the 1930s was a decade of great significance for airline pilots. It was a decade marked by pilot pushing, horribly unsafe flying conditions, and a company mentality that pilots were an expendable commodity. Fly at all costs, under all conditions, just make sure the mail is delivered on time. That was a decade that ALPA was formed in 1931. Preceding that, you can get the feeling of what those who were in charge of pilots, how they felt in some of these remarks. In 1919, pilots began to refuse flying when the weather was unsafe, and this is airmail pilots. Prager, who was the assistant U.S. postmaster in 1919, warned the pilots in a letter that they were conspiring against the government. Pilots responded that it was not a conspiracy to avoid killing oneself for the sake of a 2-cent stamp. His response he made to the press was, these pilots come into the service as every other pilot with the knowledge that they must comply with orders, and where flying conditions are such that they cannot operate, they have the option to resign. And if they refuse, removal must be made. How would you like to work under those conditions? Not good, especially when there really wasn't an IFR system. It was pretty much VFR flying, and pilots were essentially forced to do that. What else was going on in the 1930s? Economically. Great Depression. So people were willing to do just about anything to keep their jobs. So the Airline Pilots Association was founded July 27th, 1931. We finally got our first contract in 1939 with ALPA and American Airlines. We represent today more than 63,000 pilots at 35 airlines between the U.S. and Canada. And we provide 3 critical services. First one is airline safety and security. Second one is representation. The third one is advocacy, and they all touch each other. Here's some of the pilot groups that it's not an all-inclusive list. Who ever heard of Bearskin Airlines? No, just a few. Of course, and Virgin America is now.
American formed the first one with them.
Yep, in the early 60s. I think 61. And someone would have to tell me the story. So on the safety and security side, as early as the 1940s, ALPA began pushing for an independent aviation safety board. In the 1950s, they formed their own safety board, and it has grown into the largest non-governmental safety organization in the world. We also began seeing issues with crew fatigue and crew rest that has taken literally decades to work on, and we're still working on those issues. In the 1960s, new regulations concerning emergency evacuations were put in place. They were spearheaded by ALPA, and it was actually an individual captain that I assume probably had issues with an emergency evacuation and said, we got to do a better job of this. That is also the decade the NTSB was formed, something advocated by ALPA in the 40s. Anybody know why we would want an independent safety board? Transparency.
Unbiased.
Right. You have to remove all the stakeholders in an accident to really get to the truth, because the manufacturer is going to want to blame the pilots, or the airline, and the airline's going to want to blame the pilots or the manufacturer. You get the picture? The pilots are sometimes getting a lot of fingers pointed at them. So that was a huge improvement right there. In the 1970s, ALPA had fought for airport certification requirements for, I guess, about 3 decades, and that was finally put into place. Can you imagine going to? I mean, right now it's pretty standardized from airport to airport. Can you imagine having different lighting and different, I don't know what all the differences were back then because I wasn't there, but I can imagine standardization has improved safety quite a bit. We advocated for the TCAS, the traffic avoidance system. Are you guys familiar with TCAS? We love it. So it's basically we on our displays, it'll show in relative position where another aircraft is that has the TCAS equipment and it's operating, and then we can see either their absolute altitude or their relative altitude to us. And then if they're getting close to us and descending into us, or we're climbing into them at a certain rates, it gives off warnings, and it gives a caution, and then an actual resolution. We call it a resolution advisory, and it has greatly helped us avoid mid-air collisions. So, and it's not that, I don't think it's really that companies don't want to do this. All this stuff costs money, and so you need advocates to make the government require that type of safety equipment on aircraft, and that's one of the things that ALPA does. We also represent, that's probably the thing you hear the most about is, pilots fighting for new contracts, and that's certainly one of the things that we do. We do assist pilot groups with contract negotiations. We have professional negotiators. We have EF&A as economic and financial analysis, and I believe ALPA's is one of the best in the business. We say, what do you have that for? Well, I think anytime you go in negotiations with somebody, you want a successful outcome. And ALPA's EF&A department gives your airline a lot of information on the health of the economy, the health of your carrier, what they're actually able to pay, so you're not, it's really an accountability check on what you maybe want. They also can cost out every item that you're trying to gain and what every item the company is trying to gain, and say this is really the value of the contract when you look at the different variables. And if you're trying to get $100 million increased contract out of your company and they're only making $50 million a year, that's not going to work. And so it's a reality check on what you can do and what you can't do. Around 2005 at Alaska, we were not in bankruptcy. We were actually still getting small profit sharing checks, but we were headed to an arbitration for our pay. And when we were trying to, prior to that arbitration, we were trying to negotiate with a company, and the ALPA and FAA had come to our leadership and said, hey, look, you need to take a pay cut. You need to take anywhere from a 5 to 15% pay cut. And they listened. They took the 5% approach when it went to arbitration, and that didn't work too well for us because we ended up taking an average of 26%. The FOs took a 35%, I think, and the captains took a 21% pay cut. And so what I'm getting at there is that even though they give us good information, we don't always make good use of that information. Which brings to my next point is that unions, and especially ALPA, is pilots working for pilots. And pilots make the decisions. Pilots vote for representatives who represent them, and then they represent you in a larger group, and then they represent you nationally. And it really is it's a union that is you when you get on with an airline. So sometimes you make really good decisions, sometimes we make really bad decisions. But what I would say from the ALPA side is that they did arm our pilots, or our union, with good information. They just didn't maybe do the wisest thing with the information. And then we also have experts in just about every area that you would want in negotiating a contract. And Alpha National has a huge wealth of resources for every pilot group as they negotiate a contract. Individually, Alpha does a lot of help on an individual basis. You look at discipline cases. We talked about the chief pilot jobs. We call it stupid pilot tricks in the union, where it gets pilots in trouble. And sometimes those discipline cases lead to termination cases. And as a pilot, you definitely want to be represented. There's a pilot that's a friend of mine, works for another airline, that was delivering a brand new airplane, picked it up from the factory. When he departed, it was his first solo lead, I shouldn't say solo, first lead pilot on the pickup. And so when he rotated and was climbing out, he did he waved, probably was a little more aggressive on the wave than he should have been. Before he landed for fuel to get back to his destination, the company had already decided to fire him. And one of the mechanics had taken a video on his phone from way down the runway. It's not very good, but he's doing a pretty good wing rock there at low altitude, and the company just said, nope, he's out of here. This guy's a strong believer. He's had absolutely nothing on his record prior to that point, and without even talking with him, he was gone. Thankfully, he was represented by a union, and today has his job back. So, and I can tell you he is very thankful for that. FAA enforcement action. Again, we help with that, and they talked about noise levels in a 737. My first flight after training on the 737, we departed Seattle, and we took a call sign that wasn't for us, which assigned us a heading that wasn't ours. And it was, we mitigated the potential problem, but we still got too close to another airplane. And it was right after we had our accident 20 years ago yesterday. It was just a few months after that. And we had FAA people monitoring us. And so I got a letter in the mail for enforcement action. Thankfully, we had union representation in that, and which resulted in just a letter in our file for 2 years, and then it went away, so it's expunged. But just personally, I've been helped by our union efforts. We have training issues, and the union is involved in making sure there's a fair outcome, and usually the appropriate level of training. You could speak to that as you go. Grievances. We have literally have hundreds of grievances a year, and we wouldn't like it to be that high, and that's just our airline of 3,000 pilots. I think last year, and going back about a year, we're close to 1,000 grievances for this year. And I would say that most companies today, we're not dealing with stuff they did back in the 30s. We're not dealing with huge safety issues or trying to push pilots. We're dealing with companies who are trying to be more efficient and operate very lean. And when they do, the money that they spend goes towards where the revenue's coming in, not necessarily in the areas that support their employees. So you see under grievances, you see USERA. And our company alone, in 2019, the company, we were able to get $2.5 million to pilots who are military service members doing in the Guard and reserves because they did not pay them appropriately. either directly in their paycheck or in their retirement accounts. Payroll, we recouped $2.7 million to pilots in our company just for payroll errors. And so we have a payroll committee that our pilots can go to when they have issues. And if you look at those two sums, just those two areas, if every pilot shared equally in that, that's over $1,700 a pilot. So there's a lot of things that are left on the table. Those aren't necessarily intentional, but it's the attention to detail isn't there. And so that's when Tim talked about accountability. This is part of that accountability. We have the tax reform bonus up there, and that sometimes shows the intentionality of not doing the right thing. So our company chose to do a tax reform bonus after the tax changes a couple years ago. The union, shortly before it was paid out, said, hey, are you going to contribute to the 401k off of this? And they said, no, we're not going to do that. He says, well, contractually, you're required to do that. And they said, well, we're not doing it to the other employee groups, we're not doing it to you. And so they just flatly refused to do what they had agreed to do in our contract. And we had to grieve it, and they eventually did pay that to the retirement accounts. We also provide services for benefits for pilots. And I worked on an issue where our insurance company was not processing claims correctly and was costing a significant amount of money to pilots, and we were able to get that resolved. But the company was not taking care of it on their own, unfortunately. He could probably speak to many things that the former Virgin pilots had to deal with when they transitioned to our side. So I think, without a doubt, we do need a union in the airline industry. When I left LeTourneau, and just my own personal history on unions, I was 100% anti-union. I did not want to work for a company that had a union. By the time I got to Horizon and I was able to see certain things, I saw dishonesty, pushing pilots. We had pilots who were married. They weren't making much money at the regional carrier. Their wife was working. They're home with the kids. If they got called and they answered their phone, we didn't have caller ID back then. At least not many people did. They would tell them they had to come into work. And they said, well, I can't because I'm watching my kids. They say, tough, you need to find somebody to watch your kids and you need to come into work. Well, some people did what they could do and maybe get a neighbor. Maybe they didn't know the neighbor very well. I don't think I'd do that. But then we had some refuse to do it and say, hey, I'm taking care of my kids. I'm not coming into work. And then they actually were disciplining them for not coming into work. And that was probably, that particular issue was the straw that broke the camel's back in my mind. That, you know what, you guys can finish this, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And, people make mistakes. We are sinners, we're evil. And so are companies sometimes. And just as in a marriage where you need accountability with your spouse, in any relationship, a work group and employer-employee relationship, it is a relationship, and you do need accountability in that relationship, and that's something that unions provide. And we also have aeromedical support, and it's I've seen that, not personally in my life, but in the Retirement Insurance Committee, where it's an invaluable resource that our pilots can call up doctors when they're having medical issues and be able to discuss what steps need to be taken, what to avoid. They can be directed in a way that is not going to bring up other issues with the FAA as they try and get their medicals back. Advocacy. We do a lot of advocacy issues. Safety, again, is our biggest thing. If I didn't say it, ALPA's motto is schedule with safety. And the hot items right now is, you're familiar with FAR 117, that the passenger carrying airlines get to work under, but the cargo carriers don't. And just because there aren't people in back doesn't mean there's not fatigue issues and rest issues on the cargo side. And we'd like to see that apply to the cargo pilots as well. We'd like to see increased safety in shipping hazmat. Right now, the emphasis is on lithium batteries. And then there's also safety issues with drones or unmanned aircraft. I know somebody in here, you guys have a drone program? So that's one of the areas that we're working on. You guys know what secondary barriers to the flight deck? You guys have ever heard of secondary barriers? So with the 9/11 attacks, we now have bulletproof, quote unquote, bulletproof doors that lock. But we have to do certain procedures when we want to use the restroom or get food. And while they're good, they could be better. And what we would like to see is another level of safety, which is a secondary barrier. It may look like a cage that closes up so that when we open the flight deck door, we can come out, use a restroom, or the flight attendant, if they're bringing food up, can bring the food in that area, close the door, and then hand it up to us. And it would almost assure that we could get that flight deck door shut if anybody was trying to get into it before they could get through that secondary barrier. So for the safety side and for the career side, we also advocate for your careers. Have you ever heard of flag of convenience? Does that mean anything to you?
Industry. A cruise industry.
Yeah, if you look at the maritime industry, I read an article that said 4 out of 5 ships in the maritime industry are under the flag of convenience today. And the maritime industry in the U.S. is just a small fraction of what it was 60 years ago. And we have airlines, international airlines, that are doing that today and trying to get a foothold in the U.S. Norwegian Air International. Yeah, you Norwegians. In the same way, we have a Fair Skies agreement with many carriers that fly to the U.S. and where we fly into their country. And we have struggles with that with state-owned enterprises like China and Qatar and United Arab Emirates. We call those the ME3 over there, the Middle East 3 carriers, where they're not competing fairly with our airlines. I think Delta and probably United have both reduced flying in some of those cities. And I saw a statistic that for every heavy that Delta doesn't fly, it's like 800 to 1,000 jobs. So that one heavy aircraft affects not just pilot jobs, but jobs here in the U.S., which is significant. Our structure, I mentioned before, at the top are the members, and then we vote for our local leaders. Like in the Portland base, I was a secretary treasurer in Portland, and then the 3 officers in Portland would then go to Seattle and meet with the other local councils. Then that forms what we call a master executive council, and then it goes on down, and everybody's elected basically from those local executive councils. So it's really the one step up. It's the people you elect as a pilot are making the decisions for the union and the national level, and then it's just the president, the vice presidents, and the executive vice presidents really are all doing the work that they're told to do from the members. We have a lot of committees. So, like I said, it's pilots helping pilots. And what it does is it requires a lot of volunteer time. And I spent many years at Alaska without really doing much. I served on what they call a pilot committee, which is, it's minimal at best, really, and was asked to step in and do some more. And I'm glad that I have. It gives you the opportunity to serve those around you. It's just a different way to serve. It's a different form of ministry and such. And it's been interesting to see how many actual believers do get involved in union work. We've had 2 of our MEC chairmen in years past that are strong evangelical Christians. On the R&I committee, we go back once every 2 years for a seminar. And we were back for training actually on the odd year, our own retirement insurance committee. And two of the benefits and retirement attorneys are very open believers. You know, I walked into one office and went, wow, no doubt that this gal is a Christian. So it's, you know, they're all serving other pilots, and that's what it's all about. We have many different committees. There's air medicals, there's air safety. I think that should be critical incident response. There's an education committee, a negotiating committee, which is a collective bargaining committee. HEMS, somebody going to talk about that today?
Yeah, Paul's going to contact us.
Okay, excellent.
And even, as I mentioned, the education committee, we can talk more with the students with Professor Laster about a ACE Club possibility. We've got some brochures and information out there.
Excellent. There's also a jump seat committee, because we have issues sometimes from airline to airline, and when pilots are commuting, they need to get on that airplane if they can. I know we've had individual pilots at our airline who wouldn't take anybody in their jump seats, and it really is a captain-controlled seat. Sometimes I'm surprised when they'll come and ask me how many jump seaters. Will you take one jump seater? And I'll say, I'll take 2, always. You know, and we should. Hotel committees to make sure our hotels are appropriate, professional standards. You have problems working with your captain or your first officer. Sometimes it's hard to confront your captain, especially when you're a new first officer. And so the Professional Standards Committee allows you somebody to call and run by what's going on, and they can either give you some advice, and sometimes they can contact the other pilot and sometimes get you together and try and work through the issue. But it can avoid it becoming an official event with the company and having to see the chief pilot. And we have an ASAP program, which is essentially our own personal NASA form program. It's a good way to, when you do something you didn't intend to do, or you didn't know about, to be able to deal with that without any repercussions coming to your side. It also gives them data points to use for training. Let's see here. I'm not really going to get into this. I mean, we have a scheduling committee. These are just standard slides from one of the ALPAs. We have the grievance, contract performance. We have also legislative action. And some of the people, some of my fellow pilots, not many, there's a handful that I know of that are believers. They can't stand unions still. They hate unions, and they think, well, I don't like paying dues to the union because it will give to a representative that I don't want to support. So one thing ALPA does is that there's absolutely none of your dues money goes towards politicians at all. We have a volunteer, we have an ALPA PAC, or Political Action Committee, that they do give money to legislators, but they do it only if you support the PAC. So if it doesn't come out of dues, it's voluntary contributions that other pilots make if you don't want to do it. So you're not forced into doing that. But they do lobby Congress, the FAA. I mean, they work hard on issues that are important to our pilots. And I think that's it. you guys have any questions?
Do you have to join?
No, but you're probably going to be paying dues. Yes.
When I worked at UPS, we had a union as well, but the way management saw people in the union was like, well, if you're in the union, we can't promote you, right? Is there that kind of, because there was always like hostility between union and management, like, because, management felt like the union was stopping work from getting done, union felt like management was abusing workers. Is there that kind of relationship in the airline industry, or is it completely
I don't think it's the same. I mean, we have, as a line pilot, you're either first officer or captain, and it's all done via seniority. And then, of course, you have to perform. And if you're having problems in performance, the union does usually get involved to see if there's, was training done appropriately, and can we set a course for completion, and a strategy for completion, or should we go back to the right seat for a while? And every pilot that's in our management side have been union members when they were promoted. So do you guys have any thoughts on that?
So all the pilot jobs at United, they are union. And
Yeah, it's really not it's not an issue that I'm aware of.
You have people that go back and forth between union leadership and company leadership.
Yeah, that's not real popular with
Gives a hard
the
word to some
pilots.
people.
So
But there are people in that, I guess leaders are leaders, that's what they would
yeah,
say.
and I'm speaking on behalf of ALPA. American Airlines has their own pilot union. Southwest Airlines has their own pilot union. UPS has their own pilot union. And to my knowledge, the only large regional carrier that doesn't have a union is SkyWest. And there's probably a good reason. When I was convinced that it would be good to organize a union at Horizon when I was there, there were about 54 of us that signed a letter and made it public, and so we knew we'd probably have a little target on our back from management. And we were all invited to meet with to a meeting with the owner of a company called Agreement Dynamics. And so everybody at this meeting were people that signed this letter, and about 28 of us made that meeting. And when the gal started talking to us, and she was asking some specific kind of focused questions. And after about 20 minutes, she said, I'm going to let you know this meeting is done. She said, I was invited here by your management, what is clearly under false pretenses. And she says, I'll give you one, just one thing to leave you with, is that companies that have unions usually deserve unions. And, and she got up and she left. She goes, you will never see me here again because I won't work for your company. And that was pretty telling, because the company had clearly not been honest with her about why they wanted her there. And but when Steve first asked me to talk about unions, I said, well, it's pretty easy. It really is all about accountability. That's what got me to that point. And when you see what a large union can do and the type of advocacy that they can provide, it's a lot more than just about accountability. It's job protection, it's safety, it's so many different things. Anything else? All right, thank you.
So how are you guys doing? Are you burning out? You're supposed to be kind of
One more.
wrapping up. We were supposed to be wrapping